Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shihoko Goto with the Wilson Center's Asia program, and for those of you who have been able to be with us since this morning, first and foremost of all, thank you so much for being here. I know there are a lot of competing events here in town today as a result of the World Bank IMF meetings. Of course, there are the official IMF bank meetings, but there are also many private events, public events that actually go around at this time of year. So I'm particularly grateful that you have decided to spend time with us today. Let me sit down so I don't have to stand up. We spent this morning talking specifically about Japan. And the title of this discussion is about Japan's economic leadership. This topic wasn't chosen lightly. It was really to answer some of the questions about where the global economy is going and what kind of leadership and what kind of rules and what kind of guidance there is. And we came to an understanding that there are great expectations for Japan to be part of the solution amid a lot of confusion and a lot of anxiety about where the global economy is heading. And I know, for instance, the IMF has a somewhat downweight projection for the world economy at the moment. Its projection is actually at the lowest level in terms of GDP growth since about a decade ago. One of the reasons that it cites is that the ongoing trade tensions, not just between the United States and China, but also now the United States and the European Union, and a lot of trade barriers and a lot of, quite frankly, a lot of political as well as economic considerations coming into play on the trade front. But of course, trade isn't the only issue that does impact the global economy. It is a very, it plays well in the headlines, but that is certainly not the only issue. And so I'm really glad today that we have a great panel to focus on some of the other issues at stake and also to talk about what involvement there is from the private sector to be part of the solution at a time of great unease. And so hopefully you have the bios of our speakers today in front of you, but if you don't, I believe they're actually outside. But from my left, your right is Charles. He goes by Rick Johnston. He is Managing Director for Global Government Affairs at Citigroup. Next to him is Meg Luntzager, who is a public policy scholar and a former U.S. executive director for the IMF. And then next to her is Yasuhiko Hashimoto, head of Global Corporate Division at Mizuho Bank of Japan. So I'd like to start with you, Meg. This is, of course, as I said, the big time for the IMF and the World Bank to get together. It brings together finance ministers and central bank governors from the member countries, as well as a lot of corporate executives into town. The IMF report, is it too gloomy? Is it perhaps a little bit too optimistic? And I ask that because I'm concerned about the prospect for cooperation. Does the idea of multilateral cooperation occur in these meetings at the IMF, or is it really focused on analysis?
Thank you, Shihoko. Very good questions. You're absolutely right that the IMF view of the global economy right now, and the World Bank too, is a little bit on the gloomy side, not negative. They never go out and outright predict a recession. They're always very careful not to do that. But they do point out the increased risk of much slower growth, and they're forecasting slower growth across the board. And of course, we've seen recent numbers, both in the US and China and Europe, where growth has slowed down. So that's part of the IMF worry. And as you pointed out, the trade disputes, it's really adding to uncertainty that limits investment. It's fragmenting markets and supply chains, which adds to the cost of doing business for everyone. And the policy space that countries have to deal with any kind of a severe downturn is very limited. Monetary policy has been pushed to the limit, and fiscal policy, for various reasons in different countries, doesn't seem able, or governments who run fiscal policy don't seem willing to use it. I mean, there have been many messages that we'll do what we have to do, but debt is high in all our countries. I mean, not just Japan, the United States, many European countries. So, but if I might just say, what I've heard from the private sector this week during the meetings is not quite so gloomy. And it's interesting because there's a lot going on that's just going to plow ahead. Companies are working hard on keeping up with technological change. They're looking for opportunities around the world, and you were discussing that this morning in your panels. And so, yes, of course, there's always this risk assessment and the concern about, future profitability, and our two banking sector experts can speak to that. But overall, the tone in the private sector has not been quite so gloomy. Now, cooperation, yes, the IMF, World Bank are worried about that. They still feel that can happen and should happen, and you'll see signals coming out this week of some things that have been agreed, but it's clear that the major economies are not going to have direct kinds of coordination in terms of how they're going to move policy.
I'm Rick Johnson. I'm going to supplement this only because I just came from the Commerce Department before this meeting, where I was meeting with some senior officials and asked more or less the same question about, well, okay, when this administration first came into power, multilateralism was definitely not high on their list, but they were paying lip service to the idea of coordination and cooperation, particularly when it came to addressing the China, we'll call it challenge. And the statements that had been made is, oh, well, we're working very closely on a trilateral basis with Europe and Japan to deal with this problem. And I was rather, I guess, frank with my interlocutors from Commerce, and I said, well, fellas, that was a lot of lip service. Are you seeing any more real cooperation, or by virtue of all the problems that we are painfully aware of that still exist in the relationships, is it still a problem? And I asked the question of a guy who I know quite well. And he said, to be quite frank, you're right. We paid a lot of lip service to how well it was going in the trilateral context at the beginning. He said, but at the technical level, we are seeing, particularly the Europeans, we've always sort of felt like the Japanese were more or less on board. But in Europe, that was the key sticking point. And at the technical level, the Europeans are starting to get it. And he says, while it's not what it should be, we're getting there. So I was a bit...
Okay, a little more positive.
Yeah.
Glad to hear.
The challenge, though, in multilateral cooperation, though, is that the configuration is changing, right? So on the trade front, we're seeing the United States pulling out a little bit more and other countries leaning in. And again, this goes back to the underlying theme of this conference is about Japan taking on a bigger role to lead and to also have some different types of alliances on the economic front. So we see Japan no longer, well, I shouldn't say no longer, but on the multilateral trade front, we see Japan breaking out from the United States and leading the now CPTPP. It's gone ahead and done the European Union bilateral agreement as well. What about in actual financing as well? This morning, the second panel talked a little bit about the underdevelopment of capital markets in Southeast Asia, on the one hand, and then we're also hearing now, Meg and Rick, about increased demand from the private sector, and I'm assuming that this is across the board, across all regions, including the Indo-Pacific region as well. So my question to you, Hashimoto-san, is what is Japan's commitment and engagement in Southeast Asia with the ASEAN countries? How is it evolving? Do you expect more opportunities? And when we talk, there's a lot of talk about private-public partnership. Now, that sounds great, but what does it mean for you?
Thank you very much. I would like to start from, let's say, Japanese government recent announcement on their strategic initiative on Indo-Pacific, let's say, stability or the consistency in that regions. There are three big pillars of the strategies of the Japanese government. One is to improve the physical connectivity. The second one is to improve the people-to-people connectivity. And the third one is to improve the institutional connectivity. And I'd like to focus on the first one, this improve the physical connectivity, because this is to promote more of an infrastructure or the physical infrastructure in the region. And I would like to say we, or the Japanese banks, can add the value to the implementation of the strategy because we worked on already many transactions which will be to develop the infrastructures like port or road and also airports and others. And in the second session in the morning, I heard that energy is one of the important pillars of this Indo-Pacific strategy, and Japan has started to work with the United States, and LNG is certainly a big part of this cooperation. So we as a private institution or commercial institutions find the opportunities, especially in the energy. It's partly because we talked about the underdevelopment of the capital markets in Southeast Asia, and it's partly because the domestic or the local currency market has not developed enough. On the other hand, energy, almost by definition, it's dollar-based everywhere. Therefore, the currency for those energy projects are mainly in dollars or the hard currencies. So that means we can do the bank financing, especially for the construction phase. And once that construction is complete and go into operational phase, we could go to like a capital market takeout because it's dollar-based and it would generate a stable cash flow stream. And the other is also power. We can see the examples of the power, and this is a very recent example, but Indonesia has a very big and famous power project, Python. And they started with the bank financing, and they took out those bank financing with capital market issuance last year. So we can find many ways in terms of business opportunities. One is for the construction finance and also the takeout finance, especially in these dollar denominated. So that's, I think, my observation.
Can you elaborate a little bit about the role that JBIC, the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, plays, and how Japanese commercial banks work together with JBIC?
Okay, thank you very much. I would say, especially after the Lehman shock, when that availability of the dollar became very scarce, JBIC came into play, and they funded a lot of infrastructure projects. And how that works for the economics of the project is, for example, if you have to raise $2 billion of, let's say, long-term project finance from a bank market, the last dollar, this $2 billion, is very, very expensive, so that the project economics can be affected by that funding cost. On the other hand, JBIC, based on their programs, for example, if we can use overseas investment loan, which is a very popular program from JBIC, they can fund up to 50% of the project finance loans. So that means instead of $2 billion of project finance, our project can raise only $1 billion, and that's enough. So the clearing price or the dollar price for the last drop of the project finance is so different. So that means JBIC has contributed, from our perspective, JBIC has contributed a lot to improve the economics of the project finance. And that in turn benefited Japanese commercial banks because we work with JBIC financing, and we can work with JBIC for arranging and structuring the finance.
The United States is getting into the infrastructure development game as well. Yeah, is this lip service, or is this, are we, it seems from what I read and from talking to government officials that they are committed to building up the BUILD Act. They have established a new agency, which is now up and running. Same question, but different. How would the new Development Finance Corporation of the United States help U.S. companies do more to finance projects in not just in the Indo-Pacific, but across the world?
Well, thanks. By the way, the BUILD Act means, this is a wonderful title, Better Utilization of Investments Leading to Development Act. We were joking how our members of Congress keep trying to come up with these catchy acronyms. It's just amazing what they do with the names of the laws we're passing. But the BUILD Act, actually, it's not smoke and mirrors, but it's a bit of shifting around, because all it really is doing is putting OPIC on what we might say are steroids, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and combining certain elements of the U.S. Agency for International Development's, what is it called? The Finance Credit Facility, I think it is. Credit Authority, USAID Development Credit Authority. But ultimately, what the BUILD Act and the Development Finance Corporation will be doing is essentially the same thing as what OPIC was doing before. However, it does have a certain couple of features in it that are a little new. One is that the new Development Finance Corporation will be able to take equity positions in projects. Unfortunately, I have to say, so far that's only on paper, because Meg and I were chatting about this. Well, and I should also say that the BUILD Act provides that OPIC's spending cap now is set at $60 billion versus something like $29 billion as it was in the past. But the problem with the equity element of this new authority is that the Congressional Budget Office does what they call scoring on how certain programs are utilized. And the scoring in the Congressional Budget Office is so severe for the agency taking an equity position that the agency is very likely not to use that authority because it would hit their cap too soon. It's rather unfortunate. It's something I think it's going to need some work, obviously, in light of the need, as the BUILD Act was passed, to deal with, to a certain extent, to a certain extent, a counterbalancing effect to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is almost laughable when you think about $60 billion versus $1.2 trillion or something like that.
Shihoko, if I could just add, I have seen reports about, for instance, Indonesia, realizing there's this new opportunity to work with the U.S., and as Indonesia is ramping up some of its infrastructure investment in different parts of the country, I think they're hoping, some of those officials, to bring in companies utilizing these new facilities and being able to then play a bit deeper role in Indonesia, which of course U.S. firms haven't been anywhere close to what others in the region have been doing. And so I think they might welcome on that side, a little bit more diversification of their sources of investment and capital.
And to answer your question specifically, Citi is an example of a U.S. bank, works very heavily with OPIC. We have a very, very strong partnership with OPIC. And indeed, we enjoy working with your bank as well as with JBIC. We did a project with JBIC in Malaysia just recently for a power project of about $1.5 billion. So a point to be made here is, I think what happened to infrastructure finance following the financial crisis was, obviously with Basel III, all of a sudden you just could not carry these projects on your books as banks any longer, and that forced a major rethinking, a totally new finance environment for project finance. The net result was that the government banks and development banks were looked to as a source of funding. But what sank in, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what sank in over time was you can't just rely on that. You need the power of the financial markets. You need the power of private capital to make these things happen. So what we are seeing, and it's not quite public-private partnerships, but we're seeing a recognition that the government agencies that deal with reducing risk premiums, guaranteeing payments, they need to work more hand in glove with private sector and commercial banks to really see some positive developments in infrastructure finance. And I think it's starting to sink in.
I think so. And of course, if we look at the concept of PPP, the private sectors were expected to bring in more efficiencies. So that's why I also think that too much of a dependence on the government money wouldn't be, let's say, good or the ideal thing for the project to rely too much on. And at the same, as you mentioned, because of a Basel III or the new regulations, it's going to be too costly for commercial banks to carry on the long-term project finance on the book. So this government money or the public money can induce other people to come in by the involvement of the government. The project risk will be mitigated, especially the country risk or the political risk. But it's very important to emphasize on the efficiencies. So that's why, as in the second session, long-term money from institutional investors in project finance or the infrastructure finance is going to be a very, very important part of such long-term finance going forward. And at the same time, especially in Japan and in Europe, we are facing a very low interest rate environment. That actually prompted the institutional investors to look for project finance as their, let's say, as their instruments for alternative investments or to diversify their income source. So I think it's very important at this moment to look for this governmental money, commercial banks' money, and also institutional investors' money.
Diversification of portfolio obviously is something that is of benefit, but at the same time, the question becomes, is there a diversification of risk? How do we mitigate risk? Does this enhance it? Is this the best way to kind of ensure that the fear of risk is spread across the board?
I would say, given events that we're all living in right now, that the geopolitical risk premium has skyrocketed over the last 5 years to the point where the need for this kind of government cover is critical. Otherwise, you won't have a commercially viable project. It's just too costly.
And you're going to need, I think, as Hashimoto was saying, some security for, if you're going to get in the long-term investors, to then take out the project finance, right? Yeah. If you look at pension funds and insurance companies, they face a host of regulations and their own internal mandates, and admittedly they have long-term horizons, but nonetheless they have to report regularly, they have to be able to show that they're going to be meeting that. So I think the point you were making is very relevant, that you will, I think for the time being, need government, and you have institutions like the IFC, the International Finance Corporation at the World Bank, as well as other similar institutions related to the other, Asian Development Bank and other multilaterals.
All right, you've all been very patient. I'd like to open up for questions. If you do have a question, there are microphones, so if you could wait for a microphone to come and ask your question.
Hi. Question.
If you could name as well.
My name is Claudia Farris. I'm an independent researcher. I'm looking at the emergence of the global economy from the perspective of complexity science. Never mind. But the question is it possible for a country like Japan, in recognizing the geopolitical risks that emerge from our current circumstances to carve the United States out of the picture. Big surprise, no? So the world does not function if the United States is not functioning. Is this what you're telling?
I think, but still, like U.S. corporations or the U.S. government or the
US
U.S.
government.
Experiences and also the already established practice of the United States are still contributing a lot to the governance of the project, or like transparency, equitable treatment among the stakeholders. Those are, I think, established by U.S. government or the U.S. corporates. So I guess you could say U.S. government may not be functioning, but still I would say involvement by the U.S. is very important or essential. And one of the indirect impact or effect could be, for example, what's happening on China's One Belt, One Road initiative. Because of, let's say, situation with the United States, China is looking to more of a transparency in their project. And that works very good for, of course, China as a, let's say, development or the donor or the development host. And if a project makes economic sense, then that makes a good effect on the host country, and by the participation by, for example, Japanese institutions or US institutions, from the structuring point of view or from a structuring stage, we can bring transparencies or governance to the project. So I think that still works, and we cannot discount the importance of the involvement of the US parties. That's my personal opinion.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. I want to throw in one actor from China, the state-owned bank. Like, especially you mentioned about the state guarantee for payments. And when state-owned bank of China doesn't require that, but they have partnered with another state-owned bank for example, in Southeast Asia, which kind of secures their position, which we don't, I mean, for a country doesn't have that state-owned bank wing, doesn't have that choice. How would the rising importance of state-owned bank in financing infrastructure projects in Southeast Asia, is it a game changer, do you think? Or is it just an anomaly in the long term?
I think maybe we have to separate or distinguish the state-owned bank in the form or in the sense of a policy bank and the state-owned commercial banks. And state-owned policy bank can act as a catalyst, as we discussed at this panel. And state-owned banks with, let's say, cheaper cost of capital, because they can get the capital from the state, they can also, or they can provide, let's say, long-term capital on a large scale. So there are, let's say, two distinguished roles among those people. And especially on the latter, or the state-owned commercial banks, I talk to those, let's say, big fours or big fives from China, and compared to our experiences 5-6 years ago, they started to talk more on structures or equitable treatment among the stakeholders. So their activities, I think, are getting or converging into the activities or the tendencies or the requirement of the Western banks and also the Japanese banks. Because I think they start to realize those, let's say, important disciplines. for the successful projects?
I don't have a specific answer in terms of your question. Is it a game changer? Because when you consider it's sort of a parallel example of export credit agencies and how governments step in there. As long as you can develop some disciplines, then I don't see it necessarily as a game changer. But if that element of state subsidy, if you will, goes unchecked, yeah, for certain markets, it could be very, very significant. And of course, this hits on the larger topic of state-owned enterprises in general, and the need for disciplines when it comes to competing in a commercial context. I think goes back to the earlier point about multilateral cooperation. If the major market-oriented economies don't start to work together in a more cooperative manner to start to rein in this kind of state enterprise activity, I think we are going to suffer some serious consequences.
I'm Kent Hughes here at the Wilson Center. Thank you. This is a very informative panel about it. For what many people think of as a very technical subject, but you can see how much difference it makes in terms of growth and prosperity and so forth. Many years ago, several decades ago, there was a concern about a lack of venture funds in the U.S. And eventually legislation was passed allowing institutional investors to take a small portion of their funds and make riskier but much higher return investments. Now you've got a host of public pension funds that are dramatically overcommitted. They've made promises based on the assumption of 7 or 8% annual growth in return. They're not getting that. Could there be, or maybe the American financial community or the global community is working with legislation that might allow, again, a certain portion of those pension funds to be involved in the infrastructure investments? Again, much higher return, but of course there's a degree of risk.
Well, for Citi's purposes, we do approach the pension funds for long-term investments. In fact, when you consider the prime sources of, if you will, private capital, pension funds are number one on our list, along with sovereign wealth funds. Sovereign wealth funds, of course, are not quite private capital, but they're supposed to operate that way. But I would say, yeah, the pension funds are finding themselves between a rock and a hard place lately because of some of these, where is it an appropriate investment? Are you supporting the wrong groups? For example, you probably saw where there's some movement in Congress right now to have the pension funds pull out of investing in certain companies in China who are supporting Chinese military operations, or the Uyghurs, in fact, in a human rights basis. So it's, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of money out there in the pension funds, but I would suspect that the government, U.S. government, will start to step in and try to channel how that money will be used. Unfortunately, I'd say, you know, it's going to restrain the options for how these pension funds want to spend their money, and they're going to have to become. And now that I'm admitting a bias here, because my job is to deal with geopolitical risk, but they're going to have to be much more aware of the geopolitical issues in which they may be ensnared when they make certain types of investments.
Well, and I think that goes hand in hand with pensioners and those holding insurance policies to understand that they're not totally free of the risk themselves. And so that's a fine line, because you don't want to destroy confidence, because those are sort of rock solid parts of, you know, the Japanese economy, the US economy, European. So that'll be a little bit touchy, but there has to be more awareness on both sides, I think.
That's why I think this fundamental strength in the economic sense is an essential factor for the successful infrastructure project. So the project needs to make sense economically on its own. That's, I think, a very important point of view. And maybe to speak a little bit about the pension situations in Japan, I guess previously they were not so enthusiastic about the infrastructure investments. But because of a very low interest rate environment, they started to look for the opportunities to invest in the infrastructure. And at the same time, because of this low interest rate environment, smaller pension funds started to merge to form a much larger pension funds. So that means they have now economies of scale. They can afford more analysts, and they can do more credit analysis. So I think they are close to be ready for the infrastructure investment on its own, like Canadian pension funds.
Rick, can I ask you about your role in assessing geopolitical risk? I mean, this is becoming a much bigger issue that, as we see growing nationalism, it's becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And on the other hand, we are seeing countries taking governance into the calculus of when they are actually dealing with countries as well. So where does this stand? Is the geopolitical risk assessment field less transparent, more transparent? What are the issues that they're going to be focusing on?
Well, it's interesting. Within Citi, we have algorithms literally that deal with risk assessment and risk weighting. But it's funny because the risk people, we have a separate department on risk, and the risk people call me and say, what do you think? and I'm giving them a totally qualitative assessment just based on open source and not open source data and information. It is definitely a growing field. There's no question about it. And I think as we become more, whether we like it or not, obviously globalization's kicked in. And the more that you look at capital flows moving across borders, the more you look at investment opportunities, particularly from matured markets where they're looking for greater growth, greater margins in the emerging markets, it's just going to become more and more important that you have some sense of how much risk are you dealing with, how do you weight it. And then ultimately, for people who have been in the banking business, you know, it's ultimately about the numbers. And it's a bit frustrating for me because sometimes, I mean, just the other day we said, don't do that. There's a lot of reputational risk involved. But from a sanctions compliance point of view, it was technically okay. And ultimately, we went with the technically okay approach.
Sorry.
You win some, you lose some. But no, it's definitely, it's fascinating. I think I have about the best job in Washington right now. But it's definitely a growth, if you will, growth field, growth discipline within banking, and frankly, in a lot of multinationals.
Us too, yes.
Hashimoto-san, would you agree with that for your bank as well?
Well, of course, consideration or the analysis of the geopolitical risk is also a very important part of our business and growing area within our institution. And I think, of course, Citi has traditionally been very strong in the emerging market. And I think Japanese institutions are also trying to catch up with their experiences. And as we grow more and more, those geopolitical risks or reputation risk can be a very important factor. And that sometimes is in the unexpected territory or unexperienced territory for us. So I think it's very important for us to examine all the possible aspects of geopolitical risks for us.
See, Marvin, yes. Yes. As long as our panelists are okay.
I think this is under the heading of geopolitical risk, sort of elephant in the room, corruption. And I'm particularly thinking of my bailiwick, Southeast Asia, and Chinese money moving into the region on very large scale, Belt and Road and everything else, and how much of that is shaped by out-and-out corruption. You want to do an infrastructure project in Laos. You're Chinese enterprise. You find the Laotian governor that you can buy off. You can make him and his family rich, and he gives you carte blanche to do whatever you want in his province in Laos. We saw it in Malaysia on a grand scale, billions of dollars literally being stolen, Chinese money. How big, a lot of talk about transparency and sort of changing Chinese institutional practices and so on. How big is this? I mean, I get this, my sense is, my hypothesis is that corruption is a bigger issue and it shapes more of what's going on in terms of both money moving and geopolitical consequences than we are willing to acknowledge.
Well, Meg was at the dinner last night. We were at the Bretton Woods dinner for the 75th anniversary. And there it was emphasized how much this corruption issue has to be tackled. I'd say it's acknowledged. It's understood, and it's understood to the magnitude that you described it. The real dilemma is how you tackle it. And there are cultural problems with this. There obviously, I think for us, when we as an American bank go into a project like that, we are compliance up to the ceiling. The good news about it is that we bring best practices to a project. But as you say, when you go down the supply chain, I'd be absolutely amazed. I practiced international law here for about 40 years, and I was in a bunch of projects where I saw it all the time, and it does happen. The question is how do you ultimately tackle it almost as an endemic issue within a culture and within a society? Rule of law, sometimes is the other buzzword for dealing with corruption. And, I think the U.S. business community, the banking community, is pushing hard on this as an example. But you're right, when you start to deal with a counterparty, a competitor, if you will, who's more than happy to not play by the rules, it's really, really hard to somehow overcome that. And it's going to take a generational kind of effort, which is, going back to it, is sort of what the Bretton Woods thing's about.
Yeah, and I would say, just to add that on the part of a lot of countries around the world, they're recognizing the heavy cost it is to their own economy of money being channeled this way and disappearing into black holes, private accounts overseas, and trying to get a handle on it and trying to figure out exactly what you were bringing up, how to tackle it, how to change the environment in their country. The international institutions are focused on this, trying to help. But it's to get it to permeate through the economy is the real challenge, even if you can start at the top. So it's something, I think you're absolutely right. It'll be a very long-term effort.
Do we have time for one more question? Okay,
Larry Greenwood, Bauer Group. So I actually want to go back to where we began with the economic outlook and ask a kind of hypothetical question, particularly of Meg, since you were at USED when IMF was trying to, I guess, repair its relationship with Asia. So God forbid there's a financial crisis, but of course at some point there's always going to be a financial crisis. How does the region cope with that this next time around? How is the IMF's relationship with Asia? Have they been able to repair the fences damaged in the Asian financial crisis? I can still remember sitting with a certain Indonesian finance minister who you know very well, saying that she would never, ever, ever go back to the IMF, and by the way, she's back. So, and Chiang Mai is still IMF tied, so they still have to go, to the IMF to begin with. So, what happens if, again, hypothetical, there's another financial crisis?
Well, I think things have changed dramatically, and I think it's because the fund made a tremendous effort to repair the relationship with a number of countries, not just in Asia, but particularly in Asia. And the focus has been more to work as partners, to help countries develop their own economic programs. If they need an IMF financing arrangement, it still needs to be an adjustment program that's internally owned in the country, that it's theirs, that they feel they can sell to their population, that they've developed, that they feel will bring about the results they're looking for. So I think more countries now are more comfortable turning to the IMF for advice as opposed to being fearful, even asking for just sort of basic questions. I think there's a much better sense of partnership. Let's hope there's not a very severe test and another severe crisis, but in the end, it's the IMF and all the members that can help mobilize resources needed in, a major global financial crisis.
All right, so with that note of cautious optimism, I please thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking our panelists today.